I grew up watching G.I. Joe in the 80s, and it had its intended effect of making me want to buy the toys, which I did quite a bit. It was hands down my favorite cartoon and most favorite toy, but as the years passed, I moved on from the franchise. I mean, I watched the live action movies when they came out, starting about 10 years ago, but this G.I. Joe RPG by Renegade Studios Games, published in 2022, has made me go back and look at the franchise a little more broadly. A lot of you, I'm sure, already know this, but G.I. Joe started as a comic way back in 1942, presumably as a propaganda tool to levy on youngsters in the US. Over the decades, the comic license was passed around and exercised by Marvel, Devil's Due, and IDW. These comics, especially the more modern iterations, don't really resemble that classic 80s cartoon very much in terms of tone. They sort of grew up with the viewers of those cartoons and took all of the characters to a more serious space. My point here is that I think to fully appreciate this G.I. Joe RPG by Renegade, you need to be at least somewhat familiar with the comics, or at least know that they exist and that G.I. Joe as a franchise is a lot more than the silly cartoons from the 80s and the toys. I'd start with the IDW series, which is still going on strong at the time of this recording. In fact, these comics are probably more important a narrative source for GMs than the cartoons. But that's just because the cartoon was so stupid. And I say that with the deepest love and feeling of nostalgia. But make no mistake, if you are basing your game of G.I. Joe the RPG off of the self-serious, brooding, military tough guy comics, you're still playing out an absurdist military fantasy not rooted in the realities of military service whatsoever. I mean, however you slice it, it's G.I. Joe. I've never bought any physical books from Renegade before, so I didn't know what to expect. In a nutshell, they put out pretty exceptional quality. This G.I. Joe tome came as a hardback with nice thick cover. The binding is stitched and there's a bookmark sewn in there. The pages feel pretty deluxe, especially in terms of the color and vibrancy. It's one of those full-sized rule books and runs about 350 pages. I appreciate the fact that this core book contains everything you need to run the game. In general, it's a very handsome volume. The team of people listed in the credits is pretty huge. As you know, Hasbro owns the rights to G.I. Joe, and you might be wondering why their own games division subsidiary Wizards of the Coast didn't make this game. I couldn't tell you the answer to that, but Renegade licensed this IP from Hasbro and is making a pretty good go of it for the moment. On the right, you get a foreword by Luke Gygax, son of D&D co-creator Gary, where he talks about serving in the military and his love of G.I. Joe. It's worth pausing on this image for a minute. All of the art that you see in this game seems to be either derived from comic books or created specifically for this book, and it's all super cool. This particular image, which is nothing short of wall poster material, really conveys how the game is trying to be more serious with the franchise. I rewatched a bunch of old G.I. Joe cartoons in preparation for this review, and it did absolutely nothing to help me. This RPG mentions the cartoons a few times, but what it really wants you to do is play a game that more resembles this image. War, violence, tough guys, heroism, and outlandish but not comical villains. The first little section of the book is written as a debriefing by General Hawk to new Joe recruits. Basically, he describes you as being members of Special Counter-Terrorist Group Delta, codenamed G.I. Joe, and you pretty much have one mission: to defeat Cobra, a ruthless global terrorist organization. This is actually all explained in the intro to the old cartoon, if you recall. Anyway, Cobra is run by several leaders. You got Cobra Commander, who is supposed to be a genius without a past, the Baroness, Anastasia Cisarovna, who is also a genius and extremely wealthy, Destro, a powerful arms dealer, Storm Shadow, a ruthless super ninja, Zartan and Zarana, siblings who are masters of disguise, Tomax and Zammot, corporate executives who moonlight as global terrorists, and Dr. Mindbender, a mad scientist who experiments with human minds. Most of these characters are properly statted at the end of the book in case you want to pit your Joe players against them. Then General Hawk explains how rank and uniforms work in G.I. Joe. Basically, there is no rank, really. It's less about a finely honed philosophy here and more about hand-waving. And same for the uniforms. Everyone's wearing their own strange costumes because, quote, if Cobra gets away with breaking the rules, then we need Joes who can see every way a rule can be broken. The book spends the next 18 or so pages describing specific G.I. Joe characters, but only in the loosest of terms. The artwork here is pretty remarkable, and you'll notice throughout the book that there isn't a single real projectile weapon depicted, even though in the actual game, you're mostly using conventional guns that shoot bullets. But I'll discuss that a little bit later. I'll just say that this was one of the draws to the game for me, was to see all the Joes statted out in terms of the game's rules. But Renegade is very hesitant to do that. At the time of this recording, they have released a free downloadable character sheet for Scarlet, Duke, and Roadblock at levels 1 and 20. That's it. Which is to say, you're just never going to get all of these Joes statted out at the rate they're releasing them. But again, the artwork reaches sublime levels with some of these illustrations. And I guess you can use these descriptions to inspire your own character. I don't know, this is probably the weakest section of the book writing-wise. The black text block here explains that the game's creators narrowed over 500 G.I. Joe characters down to about 80 for this book. And they also mentioned they were precluded from using some for legal reasons. I'll just tell you right now that among the pretty good number of Cobra enemies fully described later in the book, Storm Shadow and Serpentor were not among them. I'm not a hardcore G.I. Joe fan or anything, but I was hoping to see those two. The next chapter here is on character creation. We'll walk through it generally, but I don't want to get too lost in the weeds. Before making your character, you are advised to have a session 0 with your table to discuss the tone of your game. The book makes a lot of mention of running the game like the 80s cartoon, but the granularity of the rules and the artwork are really telling you to run it more seriously. Anyway, this game uses Renegade's proprietary Essence 20 system, which has 4 core stats and 21 listed skills. Those 4 stats, or essences, are strength, speed, smarts, and social. You start with 12 essence points that you dump into these 4 stats. Then you select a so-called influence, which has its own chapter. With step 4, choosing an origin basically means choosing which branch of the military or which sector of civilian life you're from. Step 5, selecting a role, helps you hone in on the specific skills that you want to strengthen. At this step, your character's stats and secondary skills all come into focus on your character sheet. The rest of the steps are more narrative in nature, describing your character and determining if you're working in a squad with other players. The book offers 4 general tiers of play broken down into level brackets. Character levels range from 1 to 20, and at the highest tiers, you're facing off against the biggest named Cobra characters like Cobra Commander and Destro. Your character can have up to 3 influences at the start, which each come with a particular influence perk that triggers when that influence comes into play in a situation. You get 1 free influence at character creation, but your second and third influence come with a character drawback called a hang-up. You can see in this table on the right all the influences you can choose from, as well as 2 or 3 example characters under each one. There are 12 influences total. For every influence you choose, you also roll a d12 to determine a related background bond. From a mechanical perspective, these are a rather soft aspect of your character, but really important for coming up with a backstory. Your origin, on the other hand, is really going to round out your character in terms of numbers. Each origin grants 1 essence point, that is, to one of your 4 core stats, and an extra skill point. It also determines your starting health. So for example, the Army origin gives you either a +1 to speed or strength, and 1 point to either athletics, conditioning, targeting, or initiative, and 2 health. The book does a great job of providing 8 or 10 related backgrounds under each origin. So in the Army example, there are a ton of Army-related professions that you can read about and choose from. The other origins include Navy, Air Force, non-branch specific military support roles like first responders, covert ops, intelligence, as well as civilian engineer, and finally scientist, which of course can be associated with any military branch you want. Roles are another spot in character creation where you're going to pick up some hard mechanical features for your Joe. The game gives you 7 roles to choose from, listed in this table on the top right. When you choose your role, you get a whole slew of perks, points, and access to certain equipment. This is the first moment where you start to see the Essence 20 system showing itself to be a little more complex than it might have seemed at first. Check out this perk progression table here, for example. Each of the 7 roles has its own set of perks and progression to follow, but perks really are where you get a lot of fun variety in gameplay. Some perks only give you an extra point here or there or unlock certain classes of equipment, but other perks afford you some exotic little powers like re-rolling certain skill tests. You get a number of perks at first level, and things can get really interesting as you unlock higher level perks. At the highest levels, the the perks are extremely powerful. Each of the 7 origins also comes with 3 focus options to choose from. For the commander, it's infiltrator, sniper, or spy, and these 3 paths each unlock even more perks as you level up. Again, at higher levels, these perks get kind of insane in terms of power and game balance. I really like this layer of the character that opens the door to interesting powers. The only thing I'd say is that for new or casual players, reading through all 7 origins and even just the starting perks is a lot. It's 24 pages of information. Even if you ignore all but one origin and focus on reading all of its perks, it's a lot to keep in mind when playing, since a lot of the perks only apply to very specific situations that you don't want to accidentally forget about. Here's a really great illustration of Roadblock with a massive energy weapon. Pure military fantasy. Essence abilities are the 4 S's I mentioned earlier. They are scored from 1 to 10 normally, and your character might attain up to 15 on a score in the most extreme of circumstances, but never above that. Robots and genetically engineered creatures can go above 15. Every time you earn an increase in an essence score, you get a skill point to spend within that essence's list of skills. A skill level can be used to either increase a skill's rank, add a specialization to a skill, or buy a new skill entirely. The way the dice work in this game is this. Anytime you need to make a test, you will be rolling 1d20 plus the applicable skills die. Each of your skills is rated by its die type, and that ranges from a D2 all the way up to a D12. After you roll the D20 and the appropriate skill die, you add the result and compare it against the target or difficulty number of the check, and you're trying to meet or beat that number. There are a couple more things though. In the case that you don't have any points in the skill being tested, you will instead roll 2d20 and take the worst of the 2 rolls as your final result. This type of roll is commonly known as rolling disadvantage, but in this game it's called a snag. And snags come up a lot with the various perks and other components of the game. The opposite of a snag, where you roll 2d20 and take the better result, is called an edge. Every game has its own name for these things these days. One last thing about dice rolls. If you happen to have a specialization in the skill being tested, you actually roll 1d20 plus that skill's die and all the dice below that die level and add them all up. Each of the 20 or so listed skills in the game are broken down by essence, and under each there are example specializations that you can buy with skill points. There are a couple of special skills that behave a little differently. For example, conditioning is one of them, where you just dump skill points into it to get more max health, no specializations for it. So here's the thing that I think can make for pretty slow gameplay when it comes to dice rolls. Anytime you are making a check, you as the player first decide which skill to apply, then start resolving dice shifts. A dice shift is anytime you need to adjust the die type for your skill, such as from a perk, special ability, equipment, environment, or narrative situation. Dice shifts are where you can end up going up beyond a D12 or down below a D2 when adding to your D20 roll. This dice shift ladder here explains it all. The problem with this approach, as I see it, is that there can end up being a lot of shifting before each roll in this game. But if you just kind of wing it and push for fast play, you could end up bypassing a lot of powerful advantages that your Joes might have. Anyway, after sorting your dice shifts, you apply a possible edge or snag to the D20 being rolled. And as far as difficulty numbers you're trying to meet or beat, this table gives you an idea of the range that the game is working with. A lot of the time, you'll probably be at the 15 to 20 difficulty. You can fumble in this game if your D20 comes up a 1 and the skill test also happens to fail. And a critical success is anytime a skill die shows its highest value and the roll is also a success. In both cases, you suffer or enjoy a narrative flourish to the check. The game also has a shared point pool called story points. These are a meta currency used to do a bunch of different things, like reroll a 1, roll a skill as if you had a specialization in it, gain a clue in a situation, things like that. You earn story points in various non-mechanical ways, and there are actually 2 to 3 story points injected into the pool at the beginning of each scene. So they are a constantly churning engine of fudge. And actually, this is one of the biggest things the game does to make it feel like the old 80s cartoon. I forgot to mention there are also a whole bunch of general perks that you can pick up as your Joe levels up. These are just as varied as the special origin perks. Some come with prerequisites so you can't pick them up right away. And of course, some of these perks are more involved than others, and some have more narrative potential. The animal pet, for example, gives you any kind of intelligent creature for a mission companion, and it connects to a whole slew of rules for pets described later in the book. Something like heavy armor training requires training in medium armor, which itself requires training in light armor. I thought a really interesting one was photographic memory, which allows you to, quote, recall the smallest details with ease from anything you've seen in the last 6 months. The way I interpret it is that the player can sort of inject details into the present scene by way of suddenly remembering it. There's really no guidance to how much narrative power the player has in this case, but it has the potential to be extremely powerful if the GM is cool. That heavy armor perk actually gets even better because once you have that, you can pick up the super heavy armor training. And equipment is half the battle in this game, without a doubt. There are a lot of equipment options, and it gets detailed enough that the game really does set itself apart from being an 80s cartoon simulator. Because if you recall, the cartoon was not about the minutia of weapons and equipment. As far as your Joe getting their equipment, there is no purchasing. Some of your gear you get by default, such as the mission-specific clothing, knife, sidearm, rifle, backpack, that sort of thing. You also get what's called an HTB access pad, which can come in the form of a tablet, watch, or integrated system in your helmet. It's what you use to communicate with your teammates and access G.I.Joe and other databases. As for more mission-specific equipment, the GM decides on what is issued to you before the mission. Carry capacity is not heavily stressed in this game, but access to higher-end equipment is fairly tightly controlled by the GM. Equipment is categorized by availability, ranging from automatic and standard all the way up to prototype, unique, and theoretical. As for the actual weapons in the game, here's another place where it's not like the cartoon. There are tons of traditional ballistic weapons. You get a whole modern spread of 20th century weaponry here. At the end of the second page here, you get a taste of something more than normal with a directed element rifle, which fires a concentrated energy beam. And here is a smart grenade, which we may have in the modern day, I'm not sure, but it definitely skirts towards science fiction. Surprisingly, that's about it for really high-tech small arms, at least right out of the gate. The thing is, at the start of a mission, Joes can upgrade many of these weapons as listed here under weapon upgrades. Obviously, certain upgrades only apply to certain weapons, but you start to get the idea about equipment in this game. Players are expected to really think about their gear and worry over upgrades and tech capabilities before each mission. The weapon upgrades go for 6 pages, and they're really what can transform all these boring 20th century weapons into military fantasy G.I. Joe technology. Crazy enough, the book encourages you to spend even more time just describing your weapons to, quote, give them personality. And then, generously, it mentions that you will always have enough ammunition during any mission. So even though this game doesn't exactly feel like a simulator of the cartoon, there are definitely elements like this with the infinite ammo that do make it feel pretty gonzo, and I appreciate that. In the case of armor, in the limited and restricted categories, there are pretty much exclusively fantasy military options, and they're a lot of fun if your Joe has the training to wear them. Just like with the weapons, there are a ton of upgrade options for battle dress, a mix of practical upgrades and more sci-fi options. The game also offers a very loosely defined gear concept called kits. Kits are packages of tools meant for specific missions. There is no exhaustive list of kits. They just come as standard, limited, and restricted. You can have a medicine kit, a burglary kit, a climbing kit. This gives you the impression that gear, other than weapons and battle dress, is pretty hand-wavy and simple. But alas, the game designers couldn't resist and had to go all out with an exhaustive list of non-weapon gear that you could be given before a mission. This list goes on for 4 pages, but it was really the last 3 items that made me sit up in my chair. Over here in the support category, you have weapons cache, artillery support, and air extraction. These are particularly special gear, if you want to call them that. The rules on pets are pretty straightforward. Basically, you pick an animal form, either land, sea, or air. Then you pick a size category, small, common, or large. Then pick a function in order to determine its abilities and starting health. Then an acute senses perk, and finally an attack. After all is said and done here, there's a very special NPC that a player can have, the animal can actually level up by way of you leveling up your animal handling skill. Interestingly, you can also have a robot companion called a drone pet. Its creation process is largely the same as the animal pet, and you level it up by investing in your technology skill. Drone pets actually have a number of interesting upgrades that I think make them more tempting than an animal pet, and these upgrades can make your robot really pretty versatile, including it taking the form of a vehicle that you can ride. As far as actual vehicles in the game, they are treated almost like a character, complete with a size rating, defenses based on essence scores, health, skills, perks, and attacks. They also have hard points, which are weapons built into the vehicle, and fire points, which is the amount of crew that can target enemies outside of the vehicle from inside. Access to vehicles is strictly controlled by the GM. Vehicles can have a number of special traits, as seen here on the left, and they all have the vehicle trait by default. If you take a closer look at the vehicle trait itself, you could see that the rules of the game really get pretty involved when it comes to vehicle combat. I would go so far as to say that the rules for vehicles are a little too involved. As the GM, if you want to run a smooth vehicle combat scene, there is a lot of stuff you're tracking since each vehicle has its own stats and perks. As far as what's on offer, it's a majority of the toys you might have seen if you were around in the 80s. Vehicles were a big part of the toy experience, so maybe that's why they put so much mechanical emphasis on them here. I don't think anything illustrates just how clunky this game's combat and vehicular combat in particular can get more than this example combat description here on the left. There's just a sharp learning curve. After a few sessions, I think it could be second nature. Combat in this game is turn-based and about as tactical as what you'd find in D&D 5e, which is to say you have a very familiar sort of initiative resolution, and then everyone has their actions per 6-second turn until one side is defeated. Your speed rating determines how many actions you have. Speed 1 gives you either a move or a standard action. Speed 2 gives you both. And Speed 3 or more gives you a move, a standard action, and a number of free actions. Which is to say, free actions aren't free. If you have only Speed 1, you don't get any at all as far as I can tell. Naturally, there are a ton of rules for movement during combat, including very specific mechanics for when your Joe is prone or on rough terrain, etc., etc. Size classes affect how big the character or vehicle is on a gridded map with 5-foot squares, and you're pretty much expected to use a grid when resolving combat in this game. As far as the standard actions mentioned a second ago, they're all explained at length here. As far as actually making an attack, it's a pretty straightforward application of the Essence 20 roll mechanic. Pick your target, the GM does the dice shifts and sorts out snags and edges. Then they, or sometimes the player, decides which of the 4 essences the target will be using as their defense, which is to say, any target has one of 4 possible defense scores, and those are derived from their 4 core stats, called toughness, willpower, evasion, and cleverness. After that's decided, the roll is made and you add up the dice. If the sum meets or beats the chosen defense rating, if it's a hit and you roll damage and apply effects from whichever weapon was used. I mentioned earlier that I think skill checks could get bogged down from the dice shifting that you have to do before each roll, and that is definitely the same problem with combat. You can see here the examples of when to shift up or down the skill die. It just takes a matter of practice for the GM to figure all this quickly, I guess, and you have to hope that folks at the table don't litigate shifts too much. Up here at the top is a summary of how your 4 defense ratings are derived from your 4 core stats or essences. It's pretty straightforward. One thing about the mechanics that I really loved was how you can take damage to your essences directly. Certain attacks can temporarily whittle away at your 4 core stats, and once any of them hits 0, your Joe suffers a related disability, as summarized here. But only when your health itself goes down to 0 are you defeated. And defeated doesn't mean death necessarily. It just means that you can't take any more actions. Healing is very generous in this game. You recover all health points and 1 essence point with just 6 hours of sleep. There are some other ways to recover as well, but this one takes the cake as being really friendly. Which is appropriate, I think, because this is military fantasy after all, and debilitating, lasting injury is not really a part of that fantasy. Travel and movement rates are addressed at length because why not? Climbing, swimming, crawling, jumping are all covered, as well as visibility difficulties, and as many edge cases as you can imagine, such as fall damage, holding your breath, and extreme conditions. I thought it was interesting that the book stipulated that your Joe needs to eat a pound of food and drink a gallon of water per day or start suffering essence damage. Yet earlier in the book, it says you basically have infinite ammo. And you can suffer conditions, which each come with a mechanical penalty of one sort or another. The chapter on locations runs quickly through a handful of iconic or archetypical locations with a hint of what you can possibly do there. As a GM, I guess this chapter could be helpful to a small degree, but you really need some battle maps if you want a foothold in any session prep. The most interesting of all these locations, I thought, was Cobra Island. Even though it is still described in only the loosest of terms, it just seemed to me the most intense place for your Joes to be, since it would be swarming with the enemy by default. The threat section is more than just a list of Cobra enemies. It's a pretty nice GM section that gives you some top level tips for running this game. One thing that I was really very curious about was the author's section on balancing threats. Each enemy listed in this chapter has a threat level number, and that number corresponds to the PC's levels. So if a threat is, say, threat level 10, then exactly 4 Joes who are all level 10 should be able to take out this threat. The math on this gets really convoluted though, as you can see here in this paragraph. I'm just left wondering if the difficulty balancing is so fragile in this game that this sort of planning becomes necessary. Okay, so here's Cobra Commander, the big bad guy of the G.I. Joe franchise for all intents and purposes. Now, as I mentioned about 100 times now, I've really only indulged in the old cartoon. And in that cartoon, Cobra Commander is powerful and ruthless, but he's not exactly deadly in hand-to-hand or face-to-face combat. Yet in this game, he is the only threat with a level of 20 and has a staggering number of maxed out skills at D12. And he speaks Japanese, Mandarin, French, Scottish, Gaelic, and Spanish. I mean, I get it. They had to make Cobra Commander hard to kill because otherwise it would be a real letdown if Joes came in and wasted this guy without much effort. I think all the Cobra enemies in this chapter are generally well statted, except for how many languages all the leaders speak. That's really weird to me. Also, I think this is my favorite illustration in the whole book. Destro is looking super tough here. You get stats for regular Cobra troops, of course. Actually, a lot of troop variants. It was only when I came to this section that I wondered if you could play out a combat with real 3.75-inch G.I. Joe toys. The answer is you probably could, but you would need a pretty huge gridded map with 2x2-inch squares. Would be cool though. Again, these illustrations are pretty eye-popping. Hats off to the illustrators who worked on this book. Zartan is another major boss in the game. He's the only guy in the whole franchise who can rock that bare midriff armor. I mentioned it earlier in the video, but I found the absence of Storm Shadow to be pretty disappointing. I'm sure Renegade had a good reason for not including him. And you can sort of cobble together a Storm Shadow using stats from this red ninja master, I guess. Oh, there are a bunch of Cobra vehicles statted out here too. Unfortunately, you don't always get an illustration of what the thing looks like, so you'll need to Google some of these. There's more advice in the final chapter on how to run a mission, and there is actually a complete one-shot included on the back half of the chapter. I won't show the mission in this video in the hope that spoilers are avoided, but it is included in the core rulebook, so it might be hard to keep players from reading it. Alright, here are my thoughts on the G.I. Joe role-playing game by Renegade Games Studios. Not a cartoon simulator. There are definitely certain aspects of the game's rules that suggest that the game can be played as a silly cartoon, like the infinite ammo and the super fast healing, but in the end there's a fair amount of stuff to track every time you want to shoot a missile from a moving jeep or do some other heroic deed. If anything, this game simulates the comic books, and not the ridiculous gonzo fast-moving anything-goes cartoon. Complex vehicle mechanics. It's interesting to note that in the final chapter, the authors say that there are 3 main pillars to any G.I. Joe campaign, and that's combat, social interactions, and vehicles. Vehicles are a big deal in this game, as intended, but they are treated with so much complexity that actually running a fast and exciting scene would take a lot of practice and memorization on the part of the GM. It can be done, but there's just a huge rules burden there. Polished military fantasy RPG. This game might not have personally scratched my itch for a silly cartoon simulator, but it's still a really remarkable RPG in terms of what it does with all the perks and all the gear customizations. You're left with a genuine modern military fantasy experience. It makes me cringe a little to consider that maybe this game wears the G.I. Joe IP like a skin rather than being an integral part of its heart and soul. But if that's the case, look, you still have a rock solid military fantasy RPG in your hands, one that you can reskin to suit your own desires. Production value. The credits in the book list a whole bunch of people. Renegade Game Studios definitely seems like a studio level operation. And this book, both its presentation internally and its physical book, are grade A professional products. I think most importantly, it feels like a game that has been play tested, and the company has put a lot of faith in its Essence 20 system, which is a fun take on the D20 paradigm. When I see a company like Renegade doing G.I. Joe as well as Power Rangers and Transformers, it really gets me asking one question. Is the nostalgia for these IPs really that widespread? And for anyone who is jonesing for a G.I. Joe RPG, how many of them want a really detailed gear simulator versus something lighthearted and ridiculous? G.I. Joe definitely grew up over the years in the comics and in the live action movies. But after reading through this RPG, I realized that I haven't grown up at nearly the same rate. Let me know your thoughts on this game and if you've read it or gotten it to your table. Thanks for watching. See ya.